brand X, brand Y, brand Z. Not one sticks. Watch it again in slow motion.
Welcome to the Sticky Branding Podcast. In this show, we are unpacking how companies grow sticky brands. My name is Jeremy Miller. I am the founder of Sticky Branding and host of the show. In today's episode, I'm very excited to introduce you to Abid Virani. Abid is the co-founder and COO of Fable. Abid, welcome to the show.
Thanks a lot. Happy to be here.
So let's just dive right into the deep end. Tell me about Fable. Who are you guys and what do you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Fable's an online platform, and basically what we're trying to do is make it easy for digital teams, people who are building apps, websites, to learn about digital accessibility, to work with people with disabilities, to actually test and ultimately research opportunities to build better products. Our argument is basically that, through the process of inclusive design, you end up building not just products without barriers for people with disabilities, but ones that are more adaptable to the needs of everyone and ultimately just better and like more robust as a product.
Very cool. So before we talk, I want to unpack this whole world of accessibility and why that is so relevant, because I think there's so much we can learn from that. But before we do that, I'd love to get a bit to your origin story. You've started out in filmmaking and design, graduated from OCAD, a prestigious design school in Toronto, to co-founding a funded technology startup. How did that come about?
Yeah, I think to be honest, for me, it starts way earlier. Like as a 10-year-old, I opened Virani home studios with Napster and a CD burner. Entrepreneurship and business has been in my blood since day one. And I was always a believer in that's something that you can build a muscle with. And it didn't need to be the focus of school. So I let school and everything else I did, including work, really focus on like the things I was passionate about. Filmmaking was this incredible micro lens into human experiences and an incredible way to build empathy and to see the world and to just be exposed to a lot of different exciting problems. And then school was always a struggle for me, but the master's degree at OCAD University was called Inclusive Design. And it was the only program I applied to, and I was totally compelled by the argument. The best way to solve a problem is to solve the problem with the people who face it. Totally removing that idea of like, you can study and be the expert in this problem and solve it for thousands of people, millions of people. This was totally saying you need to unlearn how you think you solve problems. The way you solve problems is by working with people who face the problem and empowering them to solve and address the problem. And that was really compelling, and it definitely influenced how I thought about film. It influenced how I thought about pretty much every attribute of life, including, how do you build a business? And then found this problem that felt compelling from two sides, which was, one, a huge amount of the digital world is not easy to use for about 1 billion people who rely on different technologies than kind of the standard computer keyboard mouse. And so that's massive. That's this huge problem in the world that needs to get addressed. And then the other side of it was just the surprising underemployment of people with disabilities and the unique challenges they face when it comes to a 9-to-5 standard workforce kind of job opportunity, or even the little experiences that you get to build up to your professional career and how hard some of those are to access. And Fable is really the bringing together of those problems. Hey, can we create flexible employment for people with disabilities? Can we make it easy for digital teams to work with people with disabilities so that they can build accessible digital products? The rest is just now logistically, what does it take to do that?
So you didn't come to this from the perspective of a personal experience or working with, like, having disabilities of your own. It was more you saw an opportunity and a problem that you could solve.
Yeah, actually, the starting point where it got really exciting was before we had actually come up with Fable. My co-founder Elvar and I were working on a project, and it was just about remediating some textbooks that were needing to be made more accessible in a digital format. And the most efficient way to do that was to have a developer sitting right next to an individual who was blind, so that they could very easily go back and forth to make a change and test, make a change and test. And that developer sent us a meme afterwards saying, like, a guy pulling out his hair saying, 1 week of working with you guys, and I can't stop seeing accessibility issues anymore. And that was kind of like, well, how do we just make that possible for every developer out there and every designer out there, to make it personal, make it real, and then they'll be inspired to solve the problem. And we need to get out of this idea of like, I need to comply with an accessibility law, but rather, hey, if I'm good at my job, then it doesn't exclude people with disabilities.
That's amazing. And so when we look at just this platform we're on, whenever I think of anything digital, our primary mode of content is through our eyes. That obviously we stare at screens 10, 15 plus hours a day, from television to iPhones to computers and everything else. But is it primarily dealing with people with visual disabilities, or is it broader than that? How is the digital landscape and accessibility really hampering people with disabilities?
Yeah, this is really cool, because when you start talking about the technology side of it, it's really helpful to kind of change how you think about disability. So our premise of disability often is this idea of it's permanent, and you either have one or you don't. And breaking away from that and actually saying, hey, you know what? The mother holding a child who has to open a can is going to benefit from a one-handed can opener device just as much as a person that has an amputated hand. So that's something that we would call situational disability. You're in a bar and it's really loud and you want to watch TV. Well, you're benefiting from the captions just as much as the person who's hearing impaired. So disability can be organized into temporary, which is kind of like injuries, situational, which are some of those, like in a bar, loud environment, dark environment where you only have access to one arm, or permanent. And the technologies and the adaptations to experiences to address kind of the moment of pain apply across all those instances of disability. And so when you actually think about the technologies that people with disabilities use, it's actually better to say, hey, have you ever used the brightness setting on your phone? That's an assistive technology. It used to be buried in the accessibility settings. Do you use dark mode on your computer for any of the applications? Well, that's existed for a long time. It was buried in the accessibility features. A lot of things that we think about as just normal features now, even Alexa, Siri, these were developed for people with disabilities at the onset. They've just become mainstream. The audiobook is the most popular way of consuming books today. Initial purposes driven by accessibility. So the list goes on. The electric toothbrush was developed for people with disabilities, right? The list is huge. Everyone uses the ramp on a sidewalk, skateboarders, strollers. Accessibility is a way of, when you approach design, saying, hey, what are the outlier use cases? How do we build a product or an experience that is effective for those outlier use cases? But if you approach it that way, the ultimate impact impacts the mainstream. It impacts absolutely everyone. And so when we tap into the world of people with disabilities, we think of it as folks who are uniquely qualified at using a range of technologies and devices that not everyone has the skill to use. And so we cast a pretty wide net. So we have folks who have experienced injuries later in life and maybe are in a motorized wheelchair and have limited movement of neck down, to folks who are completely blind, to folks with low vision. And, that's the spectrum that we've been focused on currently, but, the spectrum just expands from there. When you look at the outliers of the human experience, like, it's more diverse than the populace that would maybe be deemed average in any way.
I love the paradigm shift you're giving us, Abid. It's because you look at some of the examples of of the audio book or dark mode, they create the velocity in our daily lives. When you look at just Siri and Alexa and those products, they are accounting for the lion's share of search on mobile now. And it solved a problem that actually opens up new markets and new ideas. So it's a beautiful paradigm shift that you're creating. So take me a step further now. Tell me more about Fable. What does your product or service do, and how does it work?
Yeah, so basically, there's this idea of the specialist, right? The individual who becomes a subject matter expert and becomes the center point for an organization. How to address accessibility, and we think that is short term. We think accessibility is not that different from building responsive websites or building private and secure websites, which means that ultimately every designer, every developer has to build this muscle and build it into the way that they do their jobs. And so what we're trying to do with Fable is say, okay, we want to democratize that knowledge. We want to spread out the responsibilities and ensure that everyone is kind of doing their part. Because the truth is that whether it's research, design, development, QA, product management, like even copywriting, there's aspects of every one of those jobs that touch and impact digital accessibility. So the way the platform works is that there's a multitude of ways to engage people with disabilities and to learn from them. We've got courses where people with disabilities are actually teaching you about accessibility. We've got the ability to conduct user interviews and to meet one-on-one with someone. A way to kind of do user acceptance testing, where you have multiple users go through a specific flow to verify that this works on your technology. So there's a variety. There's more, and our idea is basically that we want different people on the digital team to connect with people with disabilities, not just the subject matter expert and not just the researcher, but every point in development could use some understanding, some opportunity to hear from a user. And ultimately, we're hoping that the net impact of it is not just that the products that our customers build don't have accessibility barriers in them, but that we start to build out features that benefit every single user that they serve.
When you look at being a young startup today, and you've gone through your first rounds of raising money, where are you finding the immediate market need or demand? Like, who are your customers, and why are they becoming so intrigued in accessibility? And is it being forced on them, or is it their own volition?
Yeah, I think for the most part, it is their own volition. I think if you're approaching accessibility from the it's being forced upon me kind of mindset, I think that there's easier ways that don't involve a paradigm shift to try to address the compliance requirements. I think the folks who are working with us are excited by the prospect of building inclusive products means building better products. And how do we actually learn how to do that? How do we build that into our organizational processes so that it's not about, the compliance standards updated, so we have to refigure out everything and do another audit, but rather technology is evolving incredibly fast. People with disabilities are at the cutting edge of the technologies that we will use in the next 20 years, the same way they were 20 years ago. So by building products that adapt and that work with this wide range of technologies is, a way of future-proofing an organization, of standardizing code, of building robust products. And so what we're finding is that it's the teams that have the bandwidth for that type of decision making. So we're talking about organizations that often have, at least 100 people on the digital team, folks who do have, a dedicated research practice. and often folks who are managing multiple products with continuous development. So, genuine experiences that integrate into people's lives. So, Shopify is a customer. So, the store owner empowering the individual with the disability to manage and run an e-commerce product, platform, and to own and build a business, right? We work with banks, we work with government, Walmart. I think what we're seeing is these are the organizations that have the resources to invest in innovation and invest in a higher quality of inclusion. And they're looking to see some net impacts on not just, their accessibility practice, but their product.
You can also imagine that with the pandemic and the shift towards remote working and increased digital, like Shopify has exploded in the last 2 years. And we see this within the sticky branding ecosystem, that even B2B companies became direct to consumer, direct to customer type models through e-commerce, where they had never considered it before because they had salespeople doing that. So but as soon as you start getting into these new frontiers, these accessibility issues start rising so much more because you're reaching that many more people and breaking out of those constraints that we were held into.
I think what's really interesting here, and this might be a bit of a tangent, but people with disabilities have been saying for a long time that remote work can work, and more flexible employment options and digital first and remote first can be a way of being productive as an organization. And they've been fighting that battle for a long time, and they didn't really win it. COVID forced it, and now the whole world's come around to, yes, remote works. We did have the ability to go digital way faster, to leverage tools way more effectively. And so that's just an interesting piece of that whole thing. Like, I do think there's a broader trend around diversity and inclusion. I do think there's been a broad trend of modernization that organizations have been going through. But I think it's almost a little annoying that it was COVID that pushed it, not businesses saying, hey, yeah, we actually can do better, and we see the benefit. We see the positive outcome, not just on people, but on business that this could have. And I think the next frontier of this is the workplace tools. So, Slack is a customer of ours, but I think Slack is one of literally tens of thousands of workplace tools that folks are using to make their organizations run more efficiently. Well, you might have an accessible hiring practice. You might use an accessible platform to actually collect job applications. But if on day one of the job, a person is provided 12 digital tools and 9 of them don't work for them and don't even, have the ability to connect with their technology, then we're not setting people up for success either. And so I think there's some pretty huge hurdles in front of us that continue to build on kind of what we've seen from COVID. And COVID has allowed us to at least prove some arguments that I think have been made for decades and not being heard.
Well, COVID was an accelerant. It took digital transformations. People have been thinking about remote working for decades, and it just forced their hand. And now the question will be, that's what's next. But I think that underlying piece of what you're talking about, Abid, is really quite powerful just from a branding perspective. Do you see, I guess it's a two-part question. Do you see your role as being an evangelist for these types of ideas to raise the awareness of it? Because the other part of this is, it seems to be baked into your culture and your business model in your community, and having all of your, I don't know if all your employees, but all of your testers are people with defined disabilities. How do you see this from both a community and a branding perspective? Because you can just see your passion percolating here.
Yeah, I think I have a strong opinion of what I think is right and wrong. And I'm not shy about it. I think the thing we're actually trying to contribute to kind of the industry is not our opinion, but it's actually showcasing how even within an organization we have diverging opinions. I think quite broadly we're running into this issue where every organization has to have a homogenous voice, that there can't be a disagreement or debate or different perspectives. And I think that would be doing an injustice to the premise of the whole company. The disability experience, just like any human experience, is not homogenous. In fact, it similar to kind of that argument of outliers and how you build products, the lived experience of people with disabilities is increasingly unique as you delve deeper into them. So I think what we're trying to put out there actually as a brand is this is a place to have a conversation. This is a place to respectfully disagree and to have competing ideas with some maybe underlying values, which is that we think the digital world can be better than it is today, and we'd like to play a part in making it better. And there's a lot of organizations out there with that mission, and that's really exciting. Don't all have to have the same approaches. We shouldn't all have the same approaches because that's probably not the best way to actually solve the problem. And I think that's where we're sitting right now in regards to who are we as a brand is let's promote and put forth not a singular idea, but rather, most importantly, ideas from people with lived experience of disability. And let's see where that takes us. And I think what we're seeing so far is that folks are looking to Fable to hear that voice and those voices, knowing that, you're going to learn something. And that learning will hopefully help us all progress the way we think about it and approach the problem.
So you've got an audience here of business owners, people who are truly passionate about their brands. We all have websites where we are marketing and selling products, developing products. Do you have a piece of advice as you're talking just to the broader audience of how do we start? How do we think about this? If we were going to do one thing as a takeaway from today's conversation, where would you point us?
That's great. I think it's allow brands to be young, like allow things to evolve. Don't try to get it right out the gate. I think a great example is we built a product. It had a name, and then it had another name, and it's going to have a different name soon. I think allowing for iteration and responding to the market, especially in those first, let's call it 5 to 10 years. If you're really trying to build a giant, there's no way what's right in year one. Hopefully you got your name right and you love it 5-10 years later and it hasn't had holes poked in it and someone else doesn't have the same name in some other place and you're in all that kind of mess. But I think allowing brands and the personality of a brand to be young and then I think the other biggest, this isn't for everyone, but for us was don't build a brand around the founders. Like the brands are bigger than individuals and let the organization have its own personality, its own voice and shape it as a founder but also allow every other person on the team to shape it and understand that if you're doing a great job at it, it should have a life of its own. And I think that's been my biggest personal lesson, which is just don't build it around yourself and allow the organization to have a bigger brand than the individual. This reminds me of my initial kind of like experience with brand. Really was a family business as well that I rebranded, and it was rebranded on the premise of it had a name. It was my mom's name in the name of the business. And we said a few years ago that, hey, if this business is going to succeed we need to change that. Right. And I think that same premise just applies in all businesses. If you're trying to build a business that's going to grow, scale, even actually if it doesn't grow and scale from a size perspective. But if you're trying to build a business that wants to be a staple in a community for 50 years, well, like let it have its own personality. Let it have its own brand.
You speaking my language of it. It's like for sticky branding, we always say, build your brand from the inside out. And all great brands are built by people, smart, ambitious, creative people. And I think that's the true element of leadership in terms of brand building is it's not about the logos and the taglines and those types of things. It's around that development of your team around a purpose and a vision and then realizing it. And it's that work and that creativity. And you've got such a beautiful story on that, from identifying an opportunity to creating it into something that has just such purpose and impact. So it's been a real treat to be able to have this conversation with you today. As we come to a close, mindful of everybody's time here, what's the best way that we can find Fable and learn more about accessibility and what you're doing?
Awesome. I think first and foremost, we have a website, makeitfable.com. We're on social media and sharing stuff on LinkedIn and Twitter. I think on that deeper question, what can we do from that perspective of learning about accessibility? And I think it's at an individual level, really taking an extra moment to pay attention to the ones around us. 1 in 5 people in Canada live with a disability. So next time you're amongst a group of friends, realize that there's often this thing that we don't talk about that is totally part of our lives. And the chances are at some point or another, we all experience disability, whether it be temporary or permanent. The incidence of disability over the age of 65 is 40%. So let's try to normalize this, pay more attention to it is the best first step, have open conversations about it, and let's get out of that mindset of thinking that this is like a bad abnormality. There actually is very few things that are as normal as disability in our world and in our societies, and it's something that we can all take some time to reflect on and be more aware of.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, Abid, thank you for being part of today's show. And for everybody tuning in, thank you for listening to the Sticky Branding Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to us wherever you get your favorite podcast. It's available on YouTube. Be sure to like and subscribe there too. And visit us at stickybranding.com for more ideas, best practices, and services on how you can grow your business into a sticky brand.